how many of you read this piece of bull chips here. It was in the LA Times yesterday. There is a committee that's grabbing headlines, and I don't know why, because they're deliberately, intellectually honest liars. And they have the idea that 80% of what Jesus said in the Gospels and what's said about Jesus in the Gospels is not true. They're being very charitable in saying that 20% they believe is probably true. But one of the things that they're turning their guns on right now is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And they said the Gospels' empty tomb stories, such as Matthew's angels telling women that Jesus has risen, are suspect historically, say Jesus Seminar scholars who will study his deeds. Well, I got news for them. They're not scholars at all. Because some of the greatest minds in history have studied the resurrection and declared it one of the most established facts by best evidence of any fact in history. There was a man that was a brilliant law student. He was an agnostic. And he determined that when he graduated from law school and became successful as a trial lawyer, that he would take time off from his practice and once and for all destroy the myth of Christianity. His name was Frank Morrison. He did become a brilliant lawyer, and true to his vow, his hatred for Christianity, he took time off of a successful practice in order to travel about, even to the Middle East, and to seek to destroy the Christian faith by exposing it as a fraud. As he analyzed Christianity, he correctly came to the conclusion that Christianity stood or fell with the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now notice I say the bodily resurrection because anyone could say he rose in the Spirit, and there would be no way to prove it in history one way or the other. But he surmised that since Jesus himself predicated everything that he lived and taught and died for upon the fact that he would be raised from the dead bodily on the third day, that this was the key to destroying the Christian faith. So all he had to do was expose that the resurrection was a hoax and that it was not established on firm history. He began to study this, and after months of study, as he wrote later in a book about his experience, he said to his amazement, he found himself one night on his knees crying out to God to forgive him. Because his legal mind, his keen sense of evaluating evidence betrayed him. Betrayed him because it made him be honest with the evidence. And as he analyzed that evidence, he realized that the resurrection of Jesus Christ was a fact that could not be converted. It would stand up in any law court. So he later wrote a book that was different than the one he thought he would write, and it was called Who Moved the Stone? That's still available in bookstores. Who Moved the Stone by Frank Morrison. I recommend that you read that sometime. And the first chapter is called The Book That Couldn't Be Written, and he tells about his own conversion experience. Who moved the stone? That was another great legal mind. As a matter of fact, this man was the president of the Harvard Law School for 30-some-odd years. His name was Simon Greenleaf. Simon Greenleaf wrote several volumes called The Laws of Legal Evidence. They are the standard for courts evaluating evidence throughout the world. These are called the greatest work on how to evaluate evidence in existence. He was challenged by one of his students to take that great legal mind of his with his sense of evaluating evidence and to apply those to the four Gospels and to see whether these would stand up in court. And so he wrote a series called The Testimony of the Four Evangelists later. And in his section on the resurrection, he said the resurrection is established by better evidence than any fact of ancient history. We have more evidence that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead than we have evidence that Alexander the Great ever lived. And no one disputes that. So, for men who were fair, for men who were intellectually honest, who didn't have some moral bias that was forcing them to try to explain away the facts of Christianity, they came to the conclusion that anyone with a fair mind would come to, that Jesus Christ indeed was raised from the dead. You know, I'm thrilled that the Christian faith isn't based just on some emotional experience. Certainly there are emotional experiences, and we treasure those. But the Christian faith is not based on that. The Christian faith is not based on hearsay. It's not based on the tradition of the church. The Christian faith is based on the incontrovertible historical evidences of the person and work of Jesus Christ, and particularly His bodily resurrection. Now, Dr. Funk, who leads this Jesus seminar, has said that, we do believe that Jesus was raised, but He was raised in the Spirit, not with this carnal idea that has been so perpetrated upon the church that He was raised bodily. After all, who cares about the body? God does. Do you know that when we speak of resurrection, we are only speaking of the physical body? Did you know that? The moment that you come to believe that Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior, you believe that He died for you, you believe He died for your sins, and you receive the gift of pardon that He purchased by dying in your place, you receive that as a gift, then at that instant, your soul is resurrected and given spiritual life. So that takes place when you believe. The resurrection has to do with when your physical body is raised from the dead and reconstituted into an eternal form that will never to be destroyed or never disintegrate, never age. And this is what Jesus predicted would happen to Him. He didn't predict He would come back in the Spirit. He said He would come back in the body. And if He didn't come back bodily alive in 3 days, then our faith is for nothing. The Christian faith is a hoax. It's a fraud. But if He did, then everything He said is true. And it's on that Jesus Himself staked the whole Christian faith. He Himself predicted that He would be raised from the dead bodily on the third day, and He said that would prove everything that He had said. If He wasn't, then it was all disproved. Now let me read you just some of the statements that Jesus Himself made in the Scripture. And I want to present to you several circumstantial evidences of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I've done this each Easter for many years. I'm going to get even a little more extensive today. And I make no apology for going through these every Easter, because the Bible says that every Christian should know these evidences like the back of his hand. We should know that our faith is not founded just on some emotional experience or some tradition handed down by men. It's based on historical facts. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 27 Verse 62. Now on the next day, which is the one after the preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered together with Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I am to rise again.'" Now there are several lines of evidence here. First of all, in a law court, the most important evidence is that of the opposition. This is the opposition. These were dedicated enemies of Jesus, so much so that they had forced his execution. They were ruthless. They would do anything to prevent the message of Jesus spreading. They wanted to stop this movement immediately, so they forced his execution. Now that he's dead, they come before the Roman ruler, Pontius Pilatus, and they say, "We remember when this deceiver was still alive, he predicted that he would be raised from the dead on the 3rd day." Our first line of evidence is the animosity, the determined animosity of the opposition against Jesus. In other words, we can conclude that if they could do anything to disprove or to keep any false fact being proclaimed in the name of Jesus, they would do so. Secondly, we need to look at the political ambition of Pontius Pilate. Not only is it shown in the Bible, but also in many extra biblical statements about Pilate. He was a very ambitious man, and he had taken the assignment in Jerusalem because it was the most difficult assignment of governing in all the Roman Empire, and he wanted to establish a good record there so that he could advance rapidly in the Roman Senate. Now, when he found this incident, that there could be an uproar and an uprising in Palestine that would destroy his political career, he had every reason to see that nothing could be pulled off like a fake resurrection. This would cause an uproar and a civil war between these people that would be a very terrible blight against his record. So they had, for different reasons, every cause to make sure that Jesus did not come out of that tomb in any way, that no one stole the body. One of the most important lines of evidence, and it's brought out by the opposition, is that Jesus predicted his own resurrection. Now think about that for a moment. Many times he predicted it, and they knew about it. They bring it out right here. There's one case where they said, "Give us a sign." Chapter 16, they said, "Give us a sign from heaven to prove that you're who you claim to be." And Jesus said, "You hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you do not know how to discern the signs of the times." He said, "There'll only be one sign given to you, and that's the sign of Jonah the prophet. For as Jonah the prophet was in the belly of a sea monster for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man shall be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth, and then he will be raised from the dead." He said to his disciples many times that this would happen. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 21, he said, "And from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the 3rd day be raised to life." Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, you're a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. You see, Peter knew all about the prophecies that the Messiah would bring in this kingdom. And Jesus had already told them that they would rule with him over this kingdom because they had been his followers. And so Peter wanted to get on with the kingdom. He didn't like this bit about being beaten, put to death, and being raised from the dead. I mean, he wanted a crown. He didn't want a cross. And that's why Jesus was so stern with him. Well, several times more. Matthew 17:22, Mark 8:31, Mark 9:9, Mark 9:31. All the way through the Gospels, it's recorded how Jesus predicted his own resurrection. And before his bitterest enemies in Matthew 16, he said that all he lived for and all he taught and all he would die for would only be true if he came out of the grave bodily alive in 3 days. Now, who in his right mind would hazard everything he lived and died for on such a prediction? Look at the religious leaders of the world. Mary Glover Patterson Eddy. She said to her followers in Christian Science, when I die, I'll never really die. I'll come back in spirit. Well, you can't test that, can you? Her grave is still in Boston. Take some of the others. Lord Krishna of the Hindus, he said that he would come back to his followers spiritually. Can't test that either, can you? Many others, their graves are still with us. But Jesus said, everything I have taught will only be true if I come back not in a spirit, but if I come back bodily alive, not sometime, but 3 days after. That was important because on the 4th day the body starts seeing corruption. And the prophet said that the Messiah would not see corruption. And so Jesus hazarded everything upon that prediction, which showed that he was confident that it would happen. No one else would hazard that. He could have lived on his laurels. No one has ever said the things of the sort of in the way that Jesus did. You know, there's this bull about the Gospels were written years after Jesus lived by people who sort of invented the things that he said. Well, let's just look at that from a literary standpoint. I mean, that's kind of like saying that I could read Hamlet through a few times and get the hang of it and then write King Lear. I mean, that's stupid. And if you say a committee did it, that's even worse. How can a committee invent a Jesus? And if the committee did, let me know about them, because it takes a greater than Jesus to invent a Jesus. A committee? The things Jesus said stand on their own. They reverberate in the soul. They're not the sort of things that anyone has ever said. Even others have never been invented. Even in the field of fictional characters, who has ever produced a character like Jesus Christ? No one. Why? Because they're the testimonies about a person that was absolutely unique. To say they were invented would be to say they were greater than the one they invented. But Jesus said he would come out of the grave alive 3 days after he was buried. And these people are determined that the disciples will not steal the body and say that he had been raised from the dead. So they took every precaution. Let's look at some of those precautions. Verse 64, therefore give orders for the grave to be made secure until the 3rd day, lest the disciples come and steal him away and say to the people, He has been raised from the dead, and the last deception will be worse than the first. Well, we can certainly see that that would be true, wouldn't it? So Pilate said to them, you have a guard. Now this was the Roman way of saying, I authorize you to take a guard. It was a Roman guard that they took. The word used here means a Roman guard. You have a guard. Make it as secure as you know how. And they went and they made the grave secure along with the guard, and they set a seal on the stone. Now here are several facts of evidence that we need to analyze. First of all, Pilate put the securing of the tomb in the hands of who? The Jewish religious leaders. Why? Because he knew they were such fanatics, they would do everything to make sure that that tomb was secure. He put the Roman guard in their charge. That's another factor of evidence, the Roman guard. I studied from the military classical series the standard work on the Roman legions, which is called The Institutes of the Roman Legions by Vegetius. If you're a military man, you probably have seen that. If you haven't, you ought to read it, because it's the best manual on true military organization and discipline I've ever seen. But this is based on the legion and its rules, disciplines, and training at the time Jesus lived. It was the apex of the glory of the Roman army at that time. And I found, to my amazement, it took 5 years to train a legionnaire before he would be committed to a frontline battle group. 5 years. And in that 5 years, they would train the Roman legionnaire to defend 6 square feet of ground. The legionnaire knew how to do everything to defend that. And they would say, that's all your responsibility. Then they had another legionnaire next to him, and his responsibility was to know how to do everything to defend that 6 square feet of ground. That's why they fought as a unit, but they also were individually very skilled. And they had a secret weapon, as it were, in those days. You see, back then, the standard swords of the armies they met were like a scimitar, those long, curved blade things that they would come and swing like this at you. It'd usually be about 3 feet to 4 feet long, curved and very sharp on one edge. Other armies used the long rapier type of sword that they would stick with. But the Roman legion, what did they use? Well, of all things, a 24-inch blade that was sharp on both sides and pointed. A very simple little weapon, 24 inches long. It's called a machaira in the Greek. And usually when they faced armies, and they were almost always outnumbered at least 10 to 1. They rarely ever took a battlefield in which they were not outnumbered. Sometimes as much as 25 to 30 to 1. And they always won. It was because of the skill and the training vested in each one of those legionnaires. You see, these guys would come, they'd be laughing overconfident, and they'd take a swing at these guys with these big swords. Well, these guys knew how to wait till the last fraction of a second and dodge and come up under, and here's the guy, he's extended like this, they come up right under his arm and stick him, because they had a sharp sword on both sides, and it could cut coming and going. And they won. Furthermore, they were very, very trained in tactics. Now, why do I go into this? It's very important to know these were Roman soldiers, this kind of legionnaire that were assigned to guard the tomb. Also, this is what you call a maximum security situation today. In those cases, the Roman legion would assign 16 men at a watch. They figured 16 men could stand off an army until reinforcements could get there, so they never needed more than 16. Now, what would they do? There would be 4 men on a side. They'd form a square. 4 men on a side. And each one of those knew how to fight, defend his 6 feet. So they would form a square, and they could stand off anything until reinforcements could get there. This is what was assigned. The word here even means the quaternion. They had 16 legionnaires that were assigned to guard the tomb of Jesus Christ. It's one of the circumstantial evidences. We'll show that in a minute. The next circumstantial evidence is that they set a seal on the stone, and they also put the stone in place. Now, I'm glad that we have this prop up here. You see this big stone here? This is the way they look. They are flat and they roll like this. It's about that size, too. We carefully plotted that. Only the grave would not have had a round opening. The graves had a square opening. Those who go to Israel with me, I'll take you to the tomb. We believe we found the tomb in which Jesus was raised from the dead. But the stone was about yay thick, and it weighed at least 1.5 tons. The tomb in which Jesus was laid is another part of the evidence. It was a solid rock face, no bricks like that. It was hewn out of a solid rock, which was standard operating procedure for graves in those days. It was hewn out of solid rock. The openings would be between 4 to 5 feet high by about 3 feet wide. And they would have a stone that had been cut like that round that they would roll into place, and right in front of the grave opening they would cut a niche like that so it would drop down into place once it was rolled there. The tomb that's called the Garden Tomb there in Jerusalem, which we believe was Jesus' tomb, is exactly that way even today. So it was a huge stone. Now, can you imagine the kind of noise that kind of a stone would make when you roll it leaning against a solid rock face? There's no way to quietly move that stone. That's important. In addition, they set a seal on the stone once they put it in place. And by the way, it says at the beginning of verse 66, and they went and they made the grave secure. That's military terminology that is used here. It means that the Roman guard would have taken pains to make sure that everything was in order. You know why? Standard Roman legion procedure was that if you were assigned guard duty, if you failed, there was no ifs, ands, buts, excuses. You were executed. They had in fact, it's used in the New Testament. They had a slang expression in the first century. It says, keep your garment. Literally, keep your toga. You know why they said that? Because of the practice of the Roman centurions when they would go to check the watch. If they ever found a guy asleep on duty, they just put the torch to his toga and set him on fire. This tended to wake him up. And as soon as he was fully awake, the Roman centurion would just take his machaira and hit him right here. Kill him instantly. That's the way they dealt with guard duty. So if you were assigned guard duty, the first thing you did was find out exactly what was expected of you because your life depended on it. Therefore, they would have checked out the grave completely. They would have checked and made sure the body was there. That's what it means by making it secure. They would have checked the whole physical layout. They would have made sure it says they rolled the stone in place. And then they put a seal on it. But this is not a normal word. It was very well known in the ancient Roman world. They put the official seal of the Roman Empire on there with the name of the current Caesar. What they did is they would take and they would put a dab of wax on the stone, a dab of wax on the wall, and stretch a string across there and press it into the wax so that made a seal. And then they put the empress of the Roman Empire on the wax. Now everyone in the Roman Empire knew that string couldn't hold it, but they knew if they broke it, all the power of Rome would come after them. Because this was officially sealed by edict of the emperor in the name of Pontius Pilate, or Pontius Pilatus. Now, in spite of all of this, in spite of the animosity of the Jewish leaders who tried everything and made sure they would keep that body in the tomb, in spite of the ambition of Pontius Pilate, in spite of the professionalism of the Roman guard, in spite of the seal of the Roman Empire sealing that shut, 3 days later, that stone was rolled back in a miraculous manner. And when the soldiers had gotten over and cleaned themselves up a little bit from their fright, they went in and looked in there. They found that there was a strange sight there, but the body of Jesus was gone. And they fled in terror. And they fled to the Jewish religious leaders, Matthew 28 tells us, and the Jewish religious, some of them just deserted and ran for cover to hide. Some went to the Jewish religious leaders. And they told the leaders what happened, and the religious leaders said, look, we will intercede for you, we will save you, and they gave them a large sum of money. They said, you are to say that while we were asleep, the disciples came and stole the body. Okay? That was the only explanation that was ever given for over 4 centuries about the resurrection. Do you know that? It took unbelievers a long time to try to figure something else out. The only other explanation given was that he had been raised from the dead, and there were people who proclaimed they had seen him and went to the horrible deaths. Some were boiled in oil, some were crucified upside down, some were pulled apart by teams of horses, as was John Mark, the writer of the Gospel of Mark. In Alexandria, he was tied between 2 teams of horses and pulled in 2. He was told he could save his life if he would renounce that Jesus had been raised from the dead. He said, I will never renounce my Lord, and they pulled him in 2. All of them met, almost all of them met horrible deaths. Not one of them ever recanted on having seen Jesus alive. Not one. But this was the story that was circulated around. Now let's for a moment just imagine, I wished I had thought of this earlier. I thought of it while I was talking in the early service. I would have prepped somebody to be the commander of the Roman guard to put him on trial up here. But let's just pretend. We got the commander of the Roman guard sitting up here. And we're going to put him on trial about the events that have just happened. This body has disappeared. There are people in the streets saying that he's been raised from the dead. So we're going to find out the facts of the situation. Okay. You were the commander of the Roman guard, is that correct? Yes, sir. Tell me what happened. Well, sir, we were asleep, and the disciples came and they stole the body. You were asleep. Am I to believe that you're admitting you were asleep on watch? You were the commander of the guard. Am I to believe that all 16 men were asleep? That's correct, sir. You're a centurion. What's the punishment for being asleep on watch? Execution, sir. Then why haven't you been executed? Well, because the Jewish religious leaders felt sorry for me, and they interceded for us. Oh, and why did they do that? From what I've seen of them, they're a rather ruthless bunch, and they have no mercy on anyone. So why would they intercede for you, since you failed on a watch that they established you on, and they committed the keeping of this body in the tomb, and you failed? Why would they intercede for you? Well, there were some extenuating circumstances. Tell us about those extenuating circumstances. This is a complete breach of Roman discipline. Well, we were just asleep. All right, 16 of you. You are a disciplined officer. You were distinguished in battle. I see your decorations. How can I believe that 16 of you could have slept all at once on watch, knowing your lives depended on it? I went out and I checked the grave. And I noticed that the rock that sealed the tomb is very large. I took the liberty of having some people roll it. It made enough noise to wake the dead as it rolled and grated against the rock face. Now, you mean to tell me that you and 16 men, knowing your life depended on keeping that guarded, slept through this whole thing? Yes, sir. You're a disgrace to the Roman army. And you're lying. If you want to prove your case, show me one of these disciples. And by the way, they were very cowardly. They were hiding during the crucifixion. How did they suddenly get so courageous as to come and steal the body in the face of battle-trained troops? Surely you killed at least one of them as they attempted to do this. Were any killed? No, sir. You're lying. The case doesn't hold water. Do you see? When you start examining these things according to the evidence of the courtroom and the procedure of courtroom, that testimony wouldn't have held water 2 minutes. And the problem is that there were other things that absolutely defied explanation. For instance, in John chapter 19, verses 38 through chapter 20, verse 8, there's a very unusual description of how Jesus was prepared for burial. It's a very important circumstantial evidence. 2 men who were part of the Jewish religious leadership had become secret believers in Jesus as the Messiah. Their names were Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. They came to Pilate once they saw Jesus was dead, and they asked for the body of Jesus, and Pilate said, he can't already be dead. You see, usually a person suffered on a cross for at least a day or two. But they had broken the legs of these people in order that they couldn't survive. They didn't break Jesus' leg. He had already died. But Pilate couldn't believe he was already dead. You see, he died by his own will. He said he would, and he did. So Pilate sent a centurion to check, and he found, yes, Jesus was already dead. So he gave the body to Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. And they were very wealthy men. It says they were, and we know they were, because they bought 100 pounds of myrrh and aloes and linen bandages that were used for preparing people for the dead according to Jewish custom. Now, myrrh and aloes is very expensive. It was in that day. And they used that to coat these 1-inch or so strips of linen. And that, they learned this from the Egyptians when they were there. They would wrap each limb with the linen bandages, the whole torso, like a mummy, each leg separately, each arm separately, then the torso and so forth. And they would wrap all the way up to the chin. They would not wrap the head. Then they had these beautiful death napkins that they would put over the face. They were made of pure linen, beautifully embroidered with religious sayings from Judaism, and they would place that over the face of the dead person. Well, John tells us very carefully how they prepared him according to the custom, only they were more elaborate than most because they used 100 pounds of this very expensive myrrh and aloes. Myrrh was a syrupy substance that is like shellac. It's very aromatic. And they used a large sum of 100 pounds of it. And they coated each strip of linen as they wrapped the body, and they mixed that with this powdered sachet that was called aloes, a very, very expensive aromatic perfume in the powdered form. So they mixed it with that. They wrapped and coated these bandages. They wrapped Jesus like that. Well, what happened when you did this? You see, what would happen is within 24 hours, the myrrh would dry to a very hard substance. And it would actually encase the body in a very hard, tough cocoon of linen with this shellac-like substance now dried. Now, John tells us in great detail about that. Well, when the first believer in Jesus came to the tomb, it was Mary Magdalene, very early in the morning before anyone else. Mary came there and she saw the stone roll back and she saw the tomb was empty, and she just took a casual glance at the grave clothes and it scared her, and so she ran back and told the apostles that someone had stolen the body. So Peter and John, we're told in John 20, raced to get to the tomb. Well, John outran Peter because John was only a teenager. Peter was a little older. So John gets there first, and he stoops down and he looks in kind of timidly. But he didn't quite understand what he was seeing. There are 3 different words for seeing used in the original Greek of that passage. Then Peter, in his typical brash fashion, dashes right on past him into the tomb, and it says that Peter looked at the grave clothes and he just stared at them, but the word used means he looked without understanding. He couldn't understand it. And then John came on in, and it says John theorized. It's theoreo, from the word from which we get theory. He looked at them analytically, and it says he looked analytically and believed. Believed what? He believed that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And then it goes on to say, for as yet he did not understand the Scripture which said that he must be raised from the dead. In other words, what this passage is showing us is that John believed on the basis of the conditions of those grave clothes alone. He didn't have any other reason for believing. What did he see? Well, you see, what he found in that tomb was these linen wrappings that were now in a tough case in exactly the shape of Jesus' body, but with no body in it. And he realized as he studied it that there was no way for anyone to get the body out of those grave clothes and leave them exactly intact. There was no way you could have tried to cut the body up. There's no way you could have gotten them out of there without cutting the grave clothes. So he saw a perfect cocoon of the body of Jesus, but with no body in it. Then he realized something supernatural had to have happened. As a matter of fact, we know that when Jesus was resurrected, his body took on another, it's physical, but it took on a higher form. And later, when he appeared to the disciples, they said they had the doors barred and everything else, and he just walked right through the wall, right on into the room. You're going to be able to do that someday, because you're going to have a body just like Jesus. That's what we're promised. The fact that he was raised from the dead is a guarantee that you and I will be. And so when they studied this, and the clincher for John, it says he saw the death napkin neatly folded and set over on the side. You see, Jesus apparently was very neat. And that was his little P.S., I'll see you later. And so John saw that, and he realized that had to have been Jesus. He had to have come out of there somehow supernaturally. And he then just casually took the napkin, folded it neatly, and set it over on the side. Isn't that fantastic? Within a few days, these disciples were completely changed psychologically. They changed from being a bunch of wimps to being bold as lions. They went out into the same streets in which they had cowered when their Lord carried a cross through them. They went back out in the face of the same religious fanatics that they knew would kill them, and they proclaimed that Jesus was alive and that they had become murderers of the Messiah their prophets had predicted for centuries. And they were fearless. And when they were told to shut up or else we'll kill you, they said, we have to obey God and not men, and they went right back out and proclaimed it again. And Acts chapter 5 says that as a result of that, hundreds of the Jewish priests believed in Jesus. Why? Well, can you imagine if you lived in that time? You could take a 5-minute walk and go over the tomb and look at the evidence which had been sealed there so no one else could take it away. You could take a look at that and see, hey, wait a minute. This had to be something supernatural. They take a look at that, they remember the claim, and they believed. And this was against everything they had been taught. So it took powerful evidence to cause them to believe. Now, Funk says, Funk and gang, says that there's no historical evidence outside of the Bible that any of these things ever happened. Well, there is, and I'm going to read you some, but before I do, I want to say that the Bible is the best evidence that you can get of anything in recorded history of the ancient times. So I'm not putting the Bible aside and saying, well, this is not adequate, I'm going to something that's more adequate. I studied, well, my major was New Testament Greek. And I studied for 5 years the evidence of those Greek manuscripts. And not only did I study it for myself, I studied what much greater scholars than I'll ever be had said about it. But I read the actual manuscripts that date back to within 100, well, one of them dates back to within 25 years of the apostles. And I found that on the basis of what the manuscript evidence alone, that scholars down through history have said that we have more evidence to establish the veracity of every chapter of the New Testament than we have evidence that Alexander the Great ever lived. Now, no one questions that. That's how good the evidence is. Now, Funk says that, okay, so we have these records, and they were written early by the apostles, but they just dreamed up all of this. Well, now we have to go back to the determined animosity of the opposition to refute that. These facts were all proclaimed in the streets of Jerusalem. Within 10 years of the crucifixion of Jesus, Matthew wrote a Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew. He later wrote a Greek version. If those Jewish religious leaders could have done anything to disprove any fact of this, they would have done so, and we wouldn't have a Christian religion today. It was a very fragile movement. But they didn't. The only evidence they ever advanced was that the disciples came and stole the body away. And you know what malarkey that is. They never did. But let me read you. This is from the Harvard Classical Series. This is the writings of Tertullian, who was a Latin lawyer who lived between 150 and 220 A.D. I'm going to read you a famous defense that Tertullian made before the Roman Senate in 210 A.D. And he did this in order to contest the fact that there had been various Roman governors and various Caesars who had brought persecution upon the Christians. So what Tertullian was doing was defending the Christians before the Roman Senate. This is what he said, and I quote, "Because among you a God's divinity depends on a man's decision. Unless a God please man, he shall not be a God at all. In fact, man must be gracious to God." It was in the age of Tiberius Caesar, then, that the Christian name went out into the world, and he referred to the Senate the news which he had received from Pontius Pilate, Syria of Palestine, which had revealed the truth of Christ's divinity. He did this exercising his prerogative as Caesar in giving the endorsement to the divinity of Jesus on the basis of these facts. The Senate had not approved it beforehand, so they rejected it. Caesar held to his opinion and threatened danger to accusers of Christians. "Consult your histories and verify that this is so." End of quote. In other words, he not only said this to the Senate, he challenged them to study their own archives and find that that was true. So what he was doing was showing that Pontius Pilate's report to Tiberius Caesar had been so convincing that Tiberius declared Jesus one of the gods. Well, for a Roman Caesar, that was quite amazing. And he would never have been stupid enough as a lawyer to have made those sort of claims before the Senate if there weren't histories to back them up. Well, there are other statements like that. But you see, this is the sort of evidence that I have read firsthand in the original Greek. And when I hear these, you go to almost any university and they've got the, Bible as literature classes. Well, listen, the first qualification you've got to have to teach one of those classes is that you're an agnostic or an atheist. They never put a Christian to teach those classes. And those people stand up and make statements confidently and assuredly like it's the only intellectual point of view to take. And they are at least 75 years out of date with the latest archaeology. Either they don't know it or they're deliberately, intellectually dishonest, I should say. But the long and the short of it is this. The Bible tells us that in 1 Corinthians 15, that there were over 500 people who saw Jesus bodily alive after his resurrection. And this was, 1 Corinthians was written in 52 A.D. Now that would have been 19 years after the fact. And he says, many of those witnesses are still alive, although some had already been martyred. Most of those 500 witnesses died as martyrs. Not one of them ever recanted their testimony that Jesus was alive and that they had seen him. You know, it's just not possible for a man to steal a corpse out of a tomb and then go out and proclaim to the world that this man has been raised from the dead, and if you believe in him, you'll receive eternal life. And then to live a life of being persecuted and chased and tortured, and finally to meet a horrible martyr's death and still cling to the fact that that corpse was really alive. You don't do that. People don't do that. You might find a few deranged fanatics that do it, but you would never find consistently hundreds of people, 500, that all went to their graves testifying to the same thing. That doesn't happen. And furthermore, this continues, the faith they proclaim continues unabated against all opposition. So what? So this is true. So what? Well, I believe first of all, that it's important, if you are a believer in Jesus Christ, to know these things. And I'm only skimming the surface here. If you want to really learn about it, come with me to Israel, and I'll take you over the actual site and go over it. But it's important that Christians know that their faith is not just based on emotion or some elaborate tradition that got embellished as it went along. It's important to know that your faith is based on historical fact. And I'll tell you why. Because this faith is about to come under the most tremendous attack and persecution in all the long history, where we've had plenty of it. But the Bible predicts there'll be the worst ever seen at the time just before Christ returns, and we are there. You better know why you believe, because you may be called upon to die for it. And if you are called upon to die for it, you better be sure. I don't know about you, but I'm ready. And if you are still in the process of considering where you stand with Jesus Christ, the resurrection, even with evidence and everything else, is a hard thing for you to bite off. I realize that. But the really important thing is that Jesus Christ loved you so much that He was willing to take upon Himself every time you would fall short of God's perfect law. He was willing to take the rap for every time you break God's law in thought, word, or deed. And He died under that penalty in your place. Jesus said this is why He came into the world, in order that He might give His life a ransom for many. And He personally died for you. Had your name on His heart when He died. And God laid upon Him the guilt for everything you'll ever do that's wrong in your life. And when Jesus Christ was bearing the penalty for that, you know what? It was so horrible that the Bible says God drew darkness over the earth. It became inky black darkness on that hill where Jesus was hanging, because when God judged Him for the sins of the world and for you, something so terrible was happening that God just made it dark so you couldn't see it. But He did that because He loved you. And then after He had paid in full for all of these things, He shouted out just before He died a victorious shout. That's the name of this church, the Greek word tetelestai, which means literally paid in full. Now He said that because He had just paid in full for every time you'd come short of God's standard. And then He calmly bowed His head and said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. He died by His own will. When God raised Him from the dead, it was God's way of saying He has perfectly paid for all sin. Because you see, if there had been one sin for which He had not paid, it would have held Him in the grave. So it was God's way of saying, I accept what He did for you.